Our panel tonight is divided between those who wanted to leave and those who wanted to remain. The Secretary of State for exiting the EU, the man leading the negotiations on behalf of the government, David Davis, Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Brexit, Keir Starmer, the former Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition when he was leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, the Deputy Chair of UKIP, who was part of the official Vote Leave campaign, Suzanne Evans, the Times columnist, Melanie Phillips, and the former First Minister of Scotland, the SNP's International Affairs spokesman at Westminster, Alex Salmond. And our audience here tonight in Birmingham is divided tonight pretty much as the country divided in June, 48-52. 48% Remain, 52% Brexit. And I should just say, before we get started, if you want to join in this debate from home, which you may well want to, and you don't just want to throw things at the television screen, we are on Facebook. You can get to us through Twitter, or you can text us on 83981, 83981, and you push the red button, you'll see what people are texting. We take our first question then to get started. Rachel Harper, please. Rachel Harper.
Should we expect to pay a large Brexit payment to the EU when we eventually leave?
A figure of 50 billion has been put on it. David Davis, should we expect to pay a large Brexit payment? First question, before we get negotiating.
I don't know about 50 billion. I mean, I've seen 40, 50, 60. I've seen no explanation for any of them. And Prime Minister said we are coming to the end of the time when we're paying enormous sums to the European Union. We'll, of course, meet our international obligations, but we expect also our rights to be respected too. So I don't think we're going to be seeing that sort of money change hands.
Not that sort of money, but some sort of money.
Well, look, we have said before that we will meet our international obligations, or whatever that turns out to be. But that is nothing like we're talking about here. Indeed, the House of Lords committee on this subject reckoned that was zero only a few weeks ago.
Oh, so you're thinking you might pay zero?
Well,
no.
wait and see. I mean, look, I'm not going to do the negotiation on your programme, David, attractive as that might be, and it may even hold your ratings up. But the simple truth is that we have got yet to engage in negotiation. When I see Michel in a few weeks' time, no doubt I will hear exactly what he thinks is right.
Michel Barnier, who's leading the negotiations, says this has to be sorted before other talks can start.
Well,
do you agree with that?
We also take the view that the Article 50, the Article 50 in the treaty, says that we resolve the departure arrangements taking into account the ongoing relationship. That means the ongoing relationship's got to somehow exist. So we've got to do both of them in parallel.
Alex Salmond.
Well, I'm glad that David is calling Michel Barnier Michel, and this is the only positive thing I can see in the negotiations to date. Should we expect to have a bill like that? The answer is yes, and the reason we should expect it is because all of the negotiating cards are now in the hands of the European Union. We're going into a time-limited Brexit of 2 years, and if there is no deal, then you go out on WTO terms, which, despite what the Prime Minister says, would be totally disastrous. So if you go into negotiation where the cards are in the other person's hands, where you call him Michel or Monsieur Barnier, you end up paying the bill. And one thing I would say, we should expect to see the 50 billion paid into the EU long, long before we ever see the 350 million for the National Health Service that was promised by the Brexiteers.
Melanie Phillips.
Well, we should definitely meet our international obligations, but it's a question of what those obligations are. Lawyers really cannot agree about this, as far as I can see. It's very interesting that Monsieur Barnier is making this sort of prerequisite for the negotiations to start. I mean, it's almost like we're getting to a situation where we have to negotiate about the negotiations before we can actually start the negotiations. And I was wondering...
do you think he means you have to agree that bit of money before we talk about anything else? Because there is this old thing they always say, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, the final...
Exactly.
Well, indeed. I mean, you know, the negotiation hasn't started yet. He has made this very aggressive pitch. I see it as the opening negotiating pitch, and it's up to us to wear him down. David Davis mentioned the House of Lords report. It was quite an interesting report, although, as I say, lawyers do disagree. But that said, that if there is no deal, then their interpretation of the relevant statutes, the relevant treaty law, is that if there is no deal, then we don't have to pay anything at all. So maybe that's why Monsieur Barnier is so keen to get this sorted straight away.
What, so we could have no deal and just walk out and say,
well,
go away?
lawyers do disagree.
But do you agree with that?
I've no idea whether that's
oh, right, just raising
that's the case or not.
Okay.
But it seems to me that we, as in so many of these things in relation to Brexit, we actually have a strong card to play. Anyone who seems so over-anxious, as Monsieur Barnier does, to get this done and dusted so quickly, is obviously quite nervous about his position.
Rachel, what do you think? Are you worried about a big bill?
I do have some reservations, especially because of the economy. That's the one thing I'm concerned about, and I'd like to see it go forward. And both my members of my family work in the car industry, and I'm concerned about the future of that car industry.
OK, and the person up there in purple, then I'll come to you. Yes. What's your view about it?
I don't want to see our country get bullied into paying some money to the EU. I don't think it's fair. It's just the bully on the playground taking our lunch money. I don't think we should do it at all.
Right. Yeah.
OK. Nick Clegg, are we being bullied at the very opening stage of this affair?
Well, of course we're going to have to pay money. If you run up a sort of tab behind a bar for years and years and years and years, and you haven't sort of paid when you want to leave, you settle up. And the EU has been very, very clear. They're not going to ask the United Kingdom for a single penny after we have left. They're simply going to ask us to sort of settle the tab before we leave. And it would be really odd for us, and I have to say to David Davis and the government, extremely unwise of the government, on top of all the other unrealistic expectations which they've already raised about this negotiation, that it's all going to be done and dusted in 2 years. It won't be. That they'll have a cornucopia, a paradise of new trade deals with the rest of the world within 18 months. They won't. That we'll be able to have exactly the same benefits of the single market even as we leave it. This week is the week when things change, when we stop sort of talking to ourselves, lots of wishful thinking, and reality bites. We're now going to have to negotiate with 27 other governments and parliaments. And of course, when you quit a club of which we've been a member for over 40 years, of course you settle up before you leave. It's what we do in the rest of our lives, and we should do it now, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise, because all we're going to do by pretending otherwise is make you feel angry and disappointed when that doesn't happen.
Do you anticipate, though, as the President of the EU Commission said, that the bill will be, this is Jean-Claude Juncker, the bill will be, to put it a bit crudely, very hefty?
I think what's actually...
I mean, are you expecting 50 billion?
I don't know what the numbers are. I tell you what I do think, is I think what will happen, this is my prediction, is this summer, David Davis and his friend Michel will agree actually not to put a number on it at all. They'll agree a series of principles on how to decide on what the final bill is, and the final number probably won't actually be decided until the very end. That's what I think is going to happen. But please, let's not delude ourselves. You can't leave a club without paying what you have, the commitments you've made as a full member.
I think we get that point.
Nick, this is not a club. I mean, it's often, you know, when you're looking at a negotiating bid, it's often insightful to spin it around, look at it from the other side. Now, imagine if instead of being a huge donor, a sizable donor to the European Union, we were a beneficiary. Instead of putting in 10 billion a year, we received, let's say, 3 billion a year back, and we then left. Do you think he'd insist on paying us for the next 5 years?
We're not. We're a donor. But we're
It's not a golf club. It doesn't stand up.
David, you can't pretend we're something we're not. We are a major economy in the European Union. We have paid money into the... We've made a number of commitments and pledges and promises in the European Union, and all they're asking, if I understand it, is to say, we settle up before we leave, not going to ask us for a penny more.
All right,
we shouldn't fight this battle if we're not going to win it.
OK, Nick, let's go to the man there, please. Yes, you, sir.
I think we should meet our international obligations. However, I think the country is facing huge debt. Public services are suffering, and the 50 billion is too much for this country to pay.
Suzanne Evans, do you agree with him? It's too much to pay, or do you think we should pay nothing?
Absolutely. We should not be paying them a penny. And I don't know what kind of weird clubs you're a member of, Nick. But you only have to settle the bill for a club if you're in debt to that club. And we are not in debt. We should be in credit. Since we joined the European Union, we've given them over £500 billion of our money. They have used that money to invest in all kinds of swanky new buildings, which have no doubt gone up in value. I think they probably owe us. I gathered that this country's got around £9 billion vested in the European Investment Bank. I think that would more than adequately settle any bills. We should be getting that money back. And just, Rachel, if I can come back to you as you asked the original question, you're understandably worried about your family in the car industry. But let me tell you, since the Brexit vote, we now know that car production in this country is at a 17-year high. And that's got a lot to do with how manufacturing and exporting is booming since the Brexit vote. The future is very bright, very positive. And if anything, I think, it's the EU is going to be looking to us, and they'll be wanting us to bail them out, not the other way around.
Okay. And let's just stick for a moment with this payment that is the 50 billion or whatever it is that we have to pay, supposedly, before we start negotiating. Keir Starmer, what's Labour's view? Labour has now spelt out its position on, or to some extent.
Whichever way you voted in this room, we all need these negotiations to succeed. We all need them to succeed because it's about the future of our country. And the worst possible thing that can happen is that we have a big row about a big sum of money at the start before we get to the real nitty-gritty of the negotiations. So I say that we shouldn't be bandying figures around. We should agree that there will be principles that will decide how much it is. And once they're agreed, of course we must honour our obligations. And anybody who says otherwise just needs to think about the future. We want a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. Well, are we going to get that if we're breaching the rules as we leave?
Well, hang on a minute, Keir. They want that too. That's what Michel Barnier is saying he wants too.
And we want free trade agreements, the government wants free trade agreements with other countries across the world. If we are going to be taken seriously in future negotiations for the future of our country, we cannot do that in breach of obligations that we have already got. Now, I'm not committing to a figure. I think there's a lot to be said for reducing the figure. Obviously, we should keep it as low as possible. But once we've agreed the principles, of course we're a country that then honours our obligations, because if we don't do that, no country in the future is going to want to deal with us. Worst outcome for all of us.
Thank you, Keir. Let's go on to the negotiations themselves. Matthew Martin, can we have your question, Matthew?
Is Theresa May right to say that no deal is better than a bad deal ahead of the Brexit negotiations?
Is Theresa May right to say no deal is better than a bad deal before things start? Nick Clegg.
I actually think no deal is about the worst possible deal you could imagine. And no one should sort of soft soap this. If you had no deal, the day after sort of no deal, we would fall into a very peculiar economic and legal limbo. You wouldn't be able to transport nuclear fuel to the United Kingdom. We would have huge queues at Dover. We would have major question marks about how our financial system works because of the legal vacuum into which we would topple. So I think the way in which people are trying to almost make it sound like a sort of cuddly alternative, and dare I say, I think there are lots of people on the right wing of the Conservative Party and obviously in UKIP who actively want this. This is, by the way, why they want a great big spat on money in the early stages of the negotiation, because that's their perfect alibi to blow the whole thing up.
But hang on, you're actually saying a bad deal, a really bad deal would be one that would have to be accepted rather than having no deal and just
What I'm saying is that no one should think that a no-deal option is a satisfactory one for an economy the size of ours. It is a very bad thing to fall off a kind of a cliff edge into complete legal unknown, given the complexity of our economy. Right. Rachel next to you earlier said she was worried about the car industry. The car industry would just grind to a halt in terms of the exports to the rest of the European Union if we didn't have a deal.
All right. Alex Salmond, what do you make of what Theresa May said?
Well, I think it's nonsensical, and nobody is buying it. Nobody believes that no deal, WTO terms, can possibly be better than any deal. It's the
Just
worst.
explain WTO terms.
World Trade Organisation terms, which would mean, for example, a 30% tariff of Scotch beef and Scotch salmon going into the single market, for example. Lesser tariffs on manufacturing goods, but a severe economic shock. Now, the Treasury, of course, estimated the effect of a hard Brexit, no deal, as £50 billion a year on taxation. That's a drop in taxation revenues across the UK of 50 billion. Now, we've just been arguing about a one-off payment of 60 billion euros or 60 billion pounds to the EU, and of course that is a big sum. It's nothing like 50 billion a year tax loss, which was the Treasury estimate seen by the Cabinet but not by the rest of us, and of course reported in Melanie Phillips' newspaper, The Times, several months ago. So make no mistake, no deal, WTO terms, is the worst deal of all.
Right.
And that's exactly why the European Union has the upper hand in negotiations. Because whatever David tells you, he'll be desperate to avoid that circumstance. And in avoiding that circumstance, the UK government will make concessions not only in the bills to be paid, but on immigration and on other matters to avoid that going off the cliff edge, as the Prime Minister once described it. So her view of a bad deal is better than no deal is simply nonsensical, and nobody across this continent believes it.
Okay. You've had your card marked, David Davis.
Yes. Well, firstly, before I answer the question, I'd say this. No deal is not what we're playing for, Alec. I mean, it's exactly not what we're playing for.
That's why you'll make concessions.
But hang on, be fair to the questioner. Be fair to the questioner. The quotation is, no deal is better than a bad deal.
Let me just come back to that in a second. The point I want to make very, very plainly is what we're after is a good deal. And the response on no deal is better than a bad deal was after, if you remember, a number of people in the immediate aftermath, the emotional aftermath of the referendum, were talking about punishment deals and trying to harm the United Kingdom and so on. So, yes, of course, no deal is better than that. In terms of what no deal is, I mean, I too listened to Michel Barnier's comments and Nick sort of repeated them on nuclear fuel. Well, I'm afraid that's not right. The overall authority on nuclear fuel is International Energy Authority. What he said was we couldn't import or export nuclear fuel. Won't be true. It's not to do. It's at the moment under Euratom, but it'll be dealt with another way. The other issues on queues at Dover, we've got a huge contingency plan exercise across all of these issues. Every department of government. No deal is not as easy as some would have you believe, but it's a lot better than Nick and Alec would tell you. I'm afraid. So,
how do you know?
Well, because we've done a huge amount of work on exactly that.
You just said to Parliament a week ago that you hadn't worked out how much it would cost the British economy.
I said we did not make an economic forecast yet because it's not concluded, but we've spent 9 months actually putting together all the contingency plans, not because not because we don't expect it to happen, but because a government does what it actually plans for every possible outcome.
So can you describe for us...
That's what we've done.
Can you describe for us what no deal would mean, then? Since
well, it would mean
you've kept this from us up till now.
No, nobody's kept anything from anybody. We've had, you know, it's the World Trade Organization most favoured nation basis.
And
now,
your view about it?
No, it's not what we want. Our aim is a comprehensive free trade agreement. That's what we're after, because that is much better than anything else. But but no deal is not as harmful as you say.
Keir, I'll come to you in a moment. Let's just hear from one or two members of our audience on this point. The woman there in red, yes.
You've talked about the effects of trade in the event of a no deal. What about the reciprocal rights of EU citizens here and British citizens who live in the EU under a no deal?
We'll come to... I did say we'd try and get through some of these topics. We'll come to that issue later. You up there in the third row from the back. Yes.
I think that a no deal is a disaster for everyone. Not only are the anxieties of the Remainers confirmed, also the expectations of the people who want to leave will also be denied. I think no deal is not an option.
Melanie Phillips. Thank you. Melanie Phillips, do you think no deal is not an option, as she says?
I think no deal is not a good option. Definitely not a good option, but a bad deal is worse. I should say that, I don't think there's not going to be a deal. I don't think there's going to be a no deal. If you look at those remarks by Michel Barnier, other remarks by Michel Barnier a few days ago, he went out of his way to say that he wanted a good deal to be negotiated between the EU and Britain, and he also said no deal would be a disaster not just for the United Kingdom, but for the European Union. They know how bad for them no deal would be, and that is our strongest point. It's very important in a negotiation to show that you are determined, that you are not frightened, that you are not a supplicant, that you are on the front foot, not the back foot. It's therefore absolutely vital this country says we are prepared to walk away and to mean it, because otherwise the other side will have the upper hand. If we were to walk away in the worst case scenario, if that should happen, and I don't think it's going to happen, if that should happen, I don't think it would be the end of the world. It would not be good for all the reasons that have been said. But there are many countries talking about WTO rules, the imposition of tariffs. There are many countries in the world which have trade deals with the EU under WTO rules, and they seem to do rather well out of it.
All right.
Melanie is right and Alec is wrong, because every single foreign secretary I've talked to in the last several months wants a constructive outcome. They want the deal because they know it's harmful to them. They have 290 billion of exports to us, which they want to protect. So we'll have a good deal.
Keir Starmer.
No deal is the worst possible outcome, and we shouldn't allow it to be talked up. It's not just the economics. And David Davis was asked about the economics 2 weeks ago by Hilary Benn, how much is the cost difference between no deal and a bad deal, and didn't have a clue. And so we've got this mantra, no deal is better than a bad deal, and then you look behind the guard and there's nothing there. But there's something more important. There are two versions of our future and the future of the next generation out there. One is a crash out without a deal, severing relations with the EU altogether. The other is to accept we're leaving, not members, but in partnership with the EU, so that we can use collaboration and cooperation to meet challenges and to take opportunities. Now, the second of those opportunities, the second of those versions, is the version of history that I want to fight for. And I think it's a version which, whichever way people voted, we should fight for. Crashing out, severing our relations with the EU, it would be a terrible thing to do. And just one last thing on the wider issue, because it's not just economics. I was 5 years as Director of Public Prosecutions, and we were involved in very serious criminal investigations across Europe, be it terrorism, sexual exploitation, etc. That's happening all of the time. Criminal justice tools are being used all of the time. If we crash out without a deal at midnight on day X, we lose all that, and everybody will be less safe. We will lose that because we won't be in an agreement.
I'm sorry, you know, we had before the referendum, we had Project Fear, didn't we? And this is just a continuation of Project Fear. All this hyperbole about cliff edges, about crashing out, about severing our relationships with the European Union. I mean, in case you hadn't noticed, Keir, there are only 27 members of the European Union, you know, and the other countries seem to have very good relationships.
Well, they do,
with the
but
European Union,
if you want
even though they're not tied into it.
If you want a joint criminal justice investigation in relation to terrorism, you're using all the tools.
Oh, come on, are you saying that we're not... Come on, no, let's be serious here. Are you saying, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, you know, a responsible position that you held in public life,
every day, 24/7.
and are you saying that because we leave the European Union, we are going to stop sharing information about cross-border crime, about terrorism? That is utter nonsense.
All right. I want to get on. Okay. Suzanne, Suzanne Evans, where do you stand on what's going to happen on Wednesday?
Well, I
Article 50.
You know, what Melanie said is absolutely right. We want to have a deal, and I think we will get a deal. But I think if push comes to shove, if that deal doesn't involve what the British people voted for, which is to take back full control of our legal system from the European courts, to have full border control when it comes to immigration, to get our fishing waters back, then if that deal doesn't actually grant us all those things, and others that are prioritised, and Theresa May and David have both spelled out what they want priorities, which are to some extent align with what UKIP wants, then of course if we don't get those things, then no deal is definitely going to be better.
I want to hear from some members of our audience now. They've had their hands up patiently. The man there, yes, you sir, who've been waving since the beginning of the programme, yes.
I just want to take issue with the belief that the EU have the upper hand in this. Bearing in mind that we are a huge export market for most of the EU countries, particularly Germany, France and Spain, where there are a lot of expats, and they will be, their big businesses in those countries will be putting pressure on their governments to make sure that they do a satisfactory deal with us, to stop us going to India, Australia, the USA. Their big businesses will be wanting to keep the business they do with us.
A brief answer, Nick, if you would, to him.
But I think, unlike everybody on this panel, I used to work in trade negotiations, and of course, self-confidence and talking tough, everyone does it at the beginning. But you need to be realistic. This sort of petulant foot-stamping and saying, we can do you lots of harm if we stalk off, isn't impressing anyone elsewhere in Europe. And the facts, I'm afraid, suggest that it isn't as straightforward as Melanie and David have suggested. 44% of our exports go to the EU. Only 8% of their exports come this way. 13% of our GDP is down to exports to the EU. Only 3% of their GDP.
What would you do? What would you do? You know how the British people voted. What would you do when you had, if you were Prime Minister, or even Deputy Prime Minister?
I tell you what I would have done.
What would you do?
I would have sought to try and bridge the differences between what is a very, very evenly divided population on this issue in the United Kingdom, and particularly huge differences of attitude between the old and the young. And I would have tried to do that by, yes, of course, leaving the European Union, because that's what the British people have said, but not in this self-harming, destructive, hard Brexit way, quitting the customs union, quitting the single market. It's the wrong thing to do.
OK. You, sir, in the second row, the man behind you, in the second row with the striped tie, and you, sir. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
Far away.
Keir accuses David of not doing his homework with regards to numbers. So obviously you have, haven't you? So you know how bad it's going to be, and you've done the numbers.
There have been a number of reports. There's evidence in select committee reports, etc., that have set out what the economic cost is. But as I say, it's not just the economic cost. And what we've got...
What is the economic cost?
Precisely how many of the economic forecasts about Brexit have turned out to be right so far? How many? None.
You make your point. What's your point, Tim?
My point is that it is Project Fear again. But it's just anti-news. There is nothing coming from your side that says this is the cost. What is the cost?
We are going into the most important negotiations since the Second World War. Every time a reasonable question is asked, it's dismissed as unreasonable denial. Every time a challenge is made, it's branded frustrating the process. This is not healthy in a democracy if we want the right outcome for our country. There has to be challenge.
Alex Salmond, do you want to answer him?
As Gordon Brown once said, I agree with Nick. I never thought I would say it, but I'm saying it now because we know what the Treasury forecast was before Brexit, over a 15-year period. Not the apocalypse now that George Osborne said in Project Fear, but over a period of time. If you're out of the single market, it was 9.5% loss of GDP and about 2 million jobs, if that was the situation. Now, the same economists are in the same Treasury. They haven't sacked any of them. And you've got to distinguish between the presentation of George Osborne, who wanted to scare everybody to bejesus, like he did in Scotland in 2014, and the reality behind it, which is what happens if you go out of a major trading bloc. Now, you're quite right, Suzanne. There are 170 countries in this world who are not part of the European Union. But just about every single one of them is part of a trading bloc. So I've heard people say we're going to be like Singapore. Singapore is a small country in a large trading bloc called ASEAN. If you had a hard Brexit, no deal, then you go out of your trading bloc before you're back into any other trading bloc. And that's where the loss comes in. I don't think there'll be no deal. I just think that David will have to make so many concessions to Michel that the people who are looking for Brexit are going to be really, really disappointed.
The woman there with the spectacles, yes, you.
Throughout the campaign, and as Suzanne Evans herself just said, apparently a big portion of the Brexit referendum was about taking back ownership of our parliamentary democracy and our system. I'm wondering then what the panel made of Suzanne Evans' calls for High Court judges to be sacked when the Article 50 judgment was handed down.
You want to answer that?
It was absolutely disgraceful, and the reaction... You didn't say that, but you did say that judges ought to be more controlled.
Democratic
and controlled. The whole point of judges is that they independently decide cases, and the backlash against the judges when they made the judgment in the Article 50 case should have been a concern to everybody across the country, again, whichever way we voted. Nobody voted not to have a country where we've got some of the best judges in the world making decisions independently.
Let's not go back there. No, let's not go back there. Let's just stick with trade for a moment. You, sir, in the grey there on the end. Yes, you.
Yes. all this talk about deal-making, I would like to ask what's happened to diplomacy. And I think there is a moral side to what's going on. Whatever the deal is, I think that the guiding principle for both sides, that both sides are going to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, I think that's a very good point, sir. And Nick was right. If you read all of Michel Barnier's speech, not just the headlines picked out by the odd newspaper, a lot of it was incredibly constructive. You know, we want to see a deal on both sides, and it's the same thing being said around Europe. That's why, in a way, this fear of this no deal is misplaced, because there will be a deal, because everybody wants a deal, and that's where diplomacy comes in, finding the bridge. People often think that negotiations are about some sort of macho standing off. It's not. It's about finding the best outcome for everybody. And the best outcome for everybody is one that preserves their market here as well as our market there.
Why you've got your work cut out is that in most trade, in fact almost all trade negotiations I've ever been part of, the starting point is that the two parties on either side of the negotiating table want more trade as a conclusion of the negotiation than they had before. This is the first major trade negotiation I've ever encountered where the outcome will for sure, we don't know how much, be less trade because the United Kingdom is pulling out of the customs union. No, you cannot pull out. Well, let me explain why. The single market created. Well, let me explain why. The single market created by Margaret Thatcher it's got very little to do with tariffs and levies. It is a marketplace of rules. You cannot, it is logically impossible to do what David and Theresa May and the rest of them in the government are saying, that they want to have frictionless access to a single market, and then they say in the same breath, and we're not going to abide by the rulings of that marketplace.
All right.
That is impossible.
You sit in the front. Hold on. You sit in the front. And then, you want to comment on that? Yes.
We have a worldwide market which is queuing up to do deals with us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What you said regarding our exports to Europe will not quantify our exports and our imports with the rest of the world. Australia, New Zealand, Canada are on our side. If we pick up China and India, we don't really need Europe. They need us.
Okay. Hold on a second. David Davis, you said, interestingly, that whatever you get, comprehensive free trade, comprehensive customs, you want to deliver the exact same benefits as we have now. Is that your view, that this is a zero-sum game?
No.
What does exact same benefits
On the
mean?
contrary. I mean, one of the problems that happens when democracies negotiate is that the politicians are afraid of raising expectations. I think Keir was, and actually Nick were talking about this, raising expectations. The truth is, we are negotiating for the future of our country, and therefore we want to raise the expectations as much as we possibly can. We want to aim as high as we possibly can. So I make no apology for being ambitious about what we achieve. We're aiming to get the best possible deal with Europe and the best possible deal with the rest of the world. And that's what this country needs.
Okay. You say that. Thank you. The man there, respect, please. Yes.
We hear a lot of talk about team fear, but all we're hearing from the Leave side is cloud cuckoo land. You expect us to walk away from the EU, pay no money, but still get unrestricted access to a single market? If that's going to be the case, why is anyone else in the EU? Surely they'll all walk away and they'll all have unrestricted access.
What do you think David Davis should do?
Well, own up and basically say it is going to hurt us, it's going to hurt Europe. Nobody's going to come out of a winner of this. Europe's going to hurt because then we're not part of it. We're going to hurt because we're not in Europe. I personally work within the car industry. I'm worried that if we walk out with no deal, all of a sudden 10% tariffs slapped on every single car coming out of this country. What's to stop these car manufacturers moving production abroad? We already have to fight for every model we build in this country, and we're just going to give that business away if we have no deal.
David Davis?
And if you take that out of the West Midlands, we're finished as an economy.
What do you say to that? Well, I mean, Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, Nissan, Toyota, LTC, all those places, all those companies, GSK, are all putting more money into Britain this year. 16 billion since Brexit. Huge sums of money. The head of Peugeot about your industry, sir, saying whatever happens, Britain will be a good place to invest, whether it's with transnational supply networks or bringing supplier networks into Britain, creating more jobs, more investment. So I'm afraid you're not right to be so pessimistic. The options are there. The rest of the world is there. 60% of our trade, almost, is now with the rest of the world. We have got huge
David,
opportunities
admit to the
in front of
audience
us.
that you cannot make up through negotiations with far-flung countries the much, much larger trade relationships we have with our neighbours. There's a reason, by the way, why geography still matters in trade. We trade more with Ireland than we do with China. We trade twice as much with Belgium than we do with India. We trade 3 times as much with Sweden than we do with Brazil. There's a reason, because they're nearby. And this illusion that somehow we can make up for what we lose on our own doorstep by having new trade agreements with Papua New Guinea and far-flung places.
Hold it. Keir Starmer.
David rattles off a list of companies that have invested, and that's a good thing. That is a good thing.
Job, money, pay, taxes.
But we cannot be complacent about the risks to other companies. I've been going around the UK talking to hundreds of businesses, and they are really concerned about tariffs. They're really concerned about customs duties.
Do you think he's right, the man in the motor industry up there?
Yes, we have the motor industry in particular, and that's why the exact same benefits of the single market, which one of the tests that we've set out today as the Labour Party for the deal, is really important. David Davis said that the package that he hopes to negotiate will deliver the exact same benefits. We need to hold him to that, because this is not about a discussion here tonight. This is about people's jobs, their future, the businesses that they're working in. It's really serious stuff. Exact same benefits. Hold the government to account on this, because that really matters to businesses and to people who work in those businesses across our country.
As a matter of interest, how can Labour hold the government to account, since the Tories have a majority and Labour seems divided on these issues?
Well, one of the things... Well, I'm glad you've raised that, because what we've been doing over the last 3 months... What we've been doing...
is trying out a number of different positions.
No. I've been focused on three things. Getting a white paper out of the government, which they didn't want to publish. No running commentary was the starting position. Getting them to report back regularly so we know the direction of travel, and now they've committed to that. And having a vote in 2 years' time on the deal before it's signed by the European Parliament. Actually, Labour has achieved all those things, and that matters, because otherwise we've got no grip. And that's why when Davis says he's going to get the exact same benefits, well, we'll judge that at the end of the exercise. Now, it may have been a bit boring and processy, what I've been up to for the last 3 or 4 months on behalf of the Labour Party and others in the opposition, but actually that really matters, and the government didn't want to give it. Remember, no running commentary, can't possibly have a vote on the final deal. That'll undermine everything. Well, now they've conceded all that. We've got it. And that should please everybody, because Parliament needs to be involved in this process.
We'll talk about a bit later. We'll talk about more of that. Let's go on to another of the key topics. Kamaljit Baines, please.
Will there be a cap on the number of EU nationals allowed in the UK once Brexit negotiations have been concluded?
A cap on the number of EU nationals allowed into the UK once the negotiations have been concluded. Suzanne Evans, what would you like to see, and what do you think will happen?
Well, I think everybody, well, not everybody, but the vast majority of people in this country, whether they voted Leave or Remain, every single poll that's ever done shows that around 70% in this country regularly think immigration is too high. Now, I suspect we could have a long debate about how high it should be or how low it should be. I think we need to have a level of immigration to this country that is sustainable, so that we can plan for population growth accordingly, so we can make sure that there are school places available. We can make sure that the NHS isn't overstretched. We can make sure that our public services can cope with new migrants coming to the country. At the moment, we have a situation where the number of EU migrants coming to Britain is approximately the size of Newcastle, a city the size of Newcastle, every year. And that's clearly not sustainable. So I'd be very interested to hear what sort of immigration policy the government decides to put forward.
Do you want to see a cap, is the question? Do you want to see an actual cap on the number of EU nationals who come?
A cap is very tricky, isn't it? Because it allows for absolutely no flexibility. And we have at the moment, you know, a lot of companies in this country struggle because they have a cap on the number of people they can bring in from
so what exactly
outside
do you want?
the European
what do you
Union.
Want?
And then they struggle with that.
What do you want to see?
What I want to see is a sensible immigration system which actually treats everybody around the world equally. And one of the reasons I don't like the current immigration policy that we had is because it gives priority to EU nationals, and I think that's grossly unfair. I think we should be taking people who can benefit this country, and be self-supporting is, I think, very important as well. I personally think people should have a job to come to when they come here. They shouldn't be allowed to come here if they don't have a job to come to, if they're not able to support themselves and their families. But, you know, nobody in the Leave campaign ever said we want to stop immigration. So let me put the line to that.
Fine.
We just want sustainable,
well, I just heard it all. I mean, because
immigration.
the reason that UKIP were telling people they wanted to control immigration from the EU was to have more people from outside the EU if we're expected to believe what we're hearing tonight.
What? Alex, we did say that at points.
So for this audience here and for the television audience at home, this was a secret plot by UKIP to get more people emigrating into this country from outside the European Union. And of course, what Giles has told us is the fallacy behind all of this. Because the 165,000 people from out with the European Union who came into this country, Theresa May was Home Secretary for all these years, a hardline Home Secretary. She didn't stop that.
That's right. That's true.
There was no systematic attempt to stop that, or the attempt failed. You know, when David asked a few minutes ago, what should we do now? You know, the first thing we should do to try and improve the tenor of these negotiations, we say to the 3 million of our fellow citizens from the European Union who work among us, do valuable things across our public services, pay their taxes, that their welcome should not be used as bargaining chips. We should take a unilateral move to try and improve the tenor of negotiations and say to these people, as they are entitled to hear, that they are welcome in this country and we appreciate everything they've done for this country.
David, sorry, wait your turn, please.
No, that was in
No, Suzanne, will you wait your turn,
well, Alex has
please?
just accused me of
Will you wait your turn, please?
I'd just like to know
I'm sorry,
if it was in the
I can't
SNP
chair a debate of
manifesto.
6 people if you simply take...
Well, it wasn't in the
wait.
SNP manifesto, but it was in
All right,
ours.
fine. David Davis, the question is, will there be a cap on the number of EU nationals allowed?
Let me start by agreeing with Alec about one thing, and that is European citizens in the UK are doing a good job supporting the National Health Service, supporting social welfare, supporting all sorts of industries, are very important, should be made to feel welcome, should not be made to feel unwelcome, the other side of that, which has been unfortunate.
So what about what Alex suggested, that the first thing should be to say they can all stay?
I'm going to come to exactly that in a second. But well, let me deal with that now.
All right.
There are about 4 million, I think Michel Barnier referred to it too, about 4 million people we have to worry about in this context, and we have to be generous to, and we have to make sure that their rights are entrenched. 3 million of them are European citizens here, and about 1 million are British citizens abroad. We don't want to make any of them bargaining chips. By keeping them and treating them together, nobody is treated as a bargaining chip. And again, in terms of talking to, in the diplomacy, sir, in terms of talking to the foreign secretaries and prime ministers of the rest of Europe, almost every one of them raised it as the first issue. They agreed that the approach we were taking was right. They agreed that we should try and resolve this as fast as possible. And I should say that Theresa May did try and get it resolved in December, but couldn't do so. But we will resolve it pretty quickly, certainly the first thing on the batting order of the negotiation when it starts to come.
All right. The man there in blue, the blue shirt.
How on earth can you sit there and say that when the Conservative Party voted down the right to remain?
Yeah. This was an amendment to the Article 50 bill that we laid, which was to say to the government, unilaterally give protection to those that are in this country, EU nationals, who are not just contributing to our society, but they are our society. And the government voted that down. And then it voted down the amendments when they came back from the House of Lords. Now, I accept that there are, of course, UK nationals across Europe, and we need to be concerned about them as well.
To which we have a legal responsibility.
I completely accept that. Of course I accept that. We absolutely must do it. But they are being used as bargaining chips, because what David is saying is, we will hold this group of people, those that are here, so that we can secure a better deal for somebody else. Well, that is to bargain with groups of people, whether you like it or not. I accept the Prime Minister tried to get this sorted. I accept that she tried to do this. She didn't succeed, but she should then have acted unilaterally. And I think had she done so, she'd have set a very good tone for the beginning of the negotiations and got us off to a better
let's
start.
come back to Kamaljit's question. Will there be a cap, David Davis, on the number of EU nationals allowed in the UK?
What the first issue here is to bring this back under the control of the UK government, UK Parliament, to bring migration under control. I don't think most people oppose migration. I think most people are in favour of migration so long as it's managed. And the point is, it will need to be managed. Now, my job is to bring the job back, and it's for the Home Secretary to decide what the policy will be. But I cannot imagine that the policy will be anything other than that which is in the national interest, which means that from time to time we'll need more and from time to time we'll need less migrants. That's how it will no doubt work. And that will be in everybody's interest, the migrants and the citizens of the United Kingdom.
Sorry, just before we move on. Sometimes it will be more. And sometimes it will be less. More than now? You mean any number?
What it will be is whatever the government judges to be sustainable.
So the tens of thousands which the Tory party has gone on about for a long time no longer applies
I think we'll get there. But the simple truth is that we have to manage this properly. You've got industries dependent on migrants, you've got social welfare, you've got the National Health Service, you have to make sure they continue to work. Yes,
but let's take the National Health Service. The nurse registrations from Europe have dropped 75% since Brexit. In a full year, that will mean there'll be 7,000 less qualified nurses from elsewhere in the European Union working in our National Health Service. Now, I had a look at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital accident and emergency figures today before I came out.
But what do you attribute this to?
People, they've dropped by 75% because in the post-Brexit atmosphere, people cannot be secure about their position in this country.
So when they've heard what David Davis has just said, they will be.
David hasn't... I mean, look, David is the acceptable face of the Cabinet. He's not the one. It was Liam Fox who said people were to be cards to be played. I quote him exactly. David wouldn't argue that. But the reality is that our fellow citizens feel uncertain. And the reality is that nurse registrations have dropped by 75%. And I do feel, you know, some of these 7,000 missing European Union nurses would come in very handy in the accident and emergency ward at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham right now.
OK. I'll come to you in a moment, Nick. Melanie Phillips.
Well, it's a bit of a diversion to talk specifically about the health service, but since it's been raised, I mean, there is clearly a major crisis of nursing in the nurse numbers in the health service. But that crisis has been caused by the very short-sighted policies, sort of boom and bust policies of the way the NHS is run. Some years ago, when it got into difficulties, it cut nurse training. It cut nurse training for British nurses. Then there was a panic because they didn't have enough nurses, and so they went abroad, and that's why so many foreign-born nurses were brought in, many of them being paid less than British nurses. The problem with the nursing situation is what's happening here, not the problem. It's not specifically. The foundation of the problem does not lie in Europe.
So
as far as
the cap,
as far as the cap is concerned, I mean, I can't see any reason why European Union nationals should be capped specifically. We have a problem of mass immigration in this country. We have too many people for the public services to sustain that number of people. 50 to 60% of those people are coming from the European Union. We have to deal with the problem of immigration. We can only do that if we have control over our immigration policy. That is the most crucial thing of all. Given that once we have control of our immigration policy, we should bring in people for the needs of the country in the public interest. Skilled workers from the EU, certainly, but we should be deciding that, and hopefully we will.
All right, Nick, I'll come to you. Let me just hear from one or two other people. The man there, the man in the red tie, yes, you, sir, yes. And then I'll come to the person who was waving vaguely in the middle there. Yes, you, sir. No, sorry, the man in the red tie behind you with spectacles on.
Yeah, so I work in the NHS.
Yes.
Across the NHS, about 5% of all clinical posts are currently unfilled. 5% of all NHS nurses are from the EU and about 10% of doctors. Rather than talk about a cap on immigration, why don't we actually talk about how we can entice these people to stay? Why can't the government do the decent thing and tell those people who are worried about their future and about their security and tell them that they have a right to stay? You have enough to worry, Mr. Davis, in your negotiations. This is a really simple thing you could do up front before you start the negotiation. Why can't you do the decent thing and just do that?
Because the Prime Minister won't let him. That's the truth.
No, that's not
That's
true.
what he would do.
This issue will be resolved as the first issue in the negotiation. And let's be clear, I mean, the other heads of government, the other foreign secretaries who I've spoken to in the last few months, none of them have said we shouldn't worry and indeed treat the status of British citizens the same. Indeed, the Polish Prime Minister said in public in Britain that they are the same issue, not separate issues. Now, we have said over and over again, and I've said so in Parliament over and over again in responses to questions from Keir and many others, that, and Alec and others, that we view this as a moral responsibility. I view this as a moral responsibility. People should not worry about this.
Well,
they should not, because they have to. If I'm asked to make a response to the public, that's what I'm doing. And say they should not worry about this. Their position will be underwritten, will be not just their residence position, their welfare, their pensions, all of that's what we're aiming to solve. And that's what we're going to solve.
Would you come back on that? Do you feel reassured by what David Davis has said?
I think there's a lot of people who've been only here a few years, and they're probably in a different position to myself. I work in a department where about 20% of our nurses are from the EU. I think the area that you're dreaming about in the future, that you have a global trade market with all sorts of different countries, that's already a reality in healthcare. In healthcare, it's a buyer's market. People will go wherever their skills are needed. And so if people feel insecure in here, they're going to go elsewhere. So I think you don't have much time to sort this issue out.
But you're not reassured by, you don't feel more secure because of what David Davis has said, no? Are you yourself from the EU?
Yes, I am.
Where are you from?
Germany.
Thank you. The man up there in the spectacles at the back. Oh, how long have you been here, by the way, I should have said?
This May it will be 20 years.
Oh, well, you've got residency rights, and indeed you can be a citizen if you want, can't you? In that place,
I could be, but the question of citizen isn't just decided in the head, it's also in the heart, isn't it?
Okay. You sit up there.
So immigration is just one side of the coin. We all, as a country, agree that immigration is good. That's what we're hearing continuously. But what the government needs to do is think about what is the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the services, the pressure that uncontrolled immigration brings. So what I also like to hear from the government is what they're doing, as well as getting control of their immigration, their borders, what they're doing to improve the services, you know, like hospitals, other public services, infrastructure.
Okay. Nick Clegg.
Well, look, of course, I struggle to be wholly objective about this because I'm married to a Spanish lady and my mum is Dutch. She's lived here for over half a century. She's now in her 80s. She used to be a teacher. She's raised 4 children here. She's paid taxes. And, of course, I think as her son that it's scandalous that an elderly lady in her 80s is being made to feel so unsure about her own status in a country which she loves and has been very loyal to for decades and had no say, by the way, at all about what happened to the future of her country and that of her kids. So perhaps I can't be objective, but the thing I really abhor is the dishonesty of this debate. Remember what Nigel Farage did during the referendum campaign, willfully confusing the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean with Brexit, when the two are completely separate. Look at the willful distortion of the statistics, including students into the immigration statistics when clearly they shouldn't count. And the worst thing of all is this. For the last 40 years, more people have come into this country from outside the European Union than from the European Union. So somehow blaming it all on German workers in the NHS or my mum or my wife is ridiculous. In fact, since 2000, in terms of the total net migration into this country, only a quarter is accounted for the European Union. So it is fundamentally dishonest to claim that this problem, and clearly many people do regard it as a problem, can be solved by clamping down on French lawyers, German engineers and Spanish nurses. I just think it's time we have a more honest debate.
All right. Look. Yes, a brief comment from you.
I would like to say that I feel the fact is we live in a liberal market economy that propagates a hire and fire culture. Leaving the EU and ridding ourselves of protected citizens that have human rights in order to bring in cheap labour from countries that do not have protected human rights is really what is the discussion here.
All right, well, we've heard a number of voices like that. I'd like to hear from somebody who approves of restrictions on immigration. You do, ma'am. Yes?
The panel, you seem to think you've got a record of EU nationalities who come to Britain, to professionals mainly. You forget about those who are coming in during summer, during any time, EU people to come and be admitted in hospitals, and they don't pay a bill for the treatment. They go back. This is why the National Health Service is going down.
All right.
The bill is enormous.
And you, sir, behind.
The impression I get is the government has been trying to get an agreement for a while, and we never see the European Union or the Commission trying to come forward and do this. It just seems to be us trying to get the agreement, but the other countries just seem to not want to comply.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because it's politically difficult then for our parties, isn't it, the longer they leave it? I mean, they could easily come forward tomorrow and say, yeah, we'll agree with you and we'll sign off on both sides, but, you know, it seems to be us that's trying and not them.
Do you think there's ill will towards Britain about at this stage about the negotiations? Yeah. And anybody else feel strongly about that issue of the way that immigration is being handled? I go to you, yes. Yep. The man here in the second row. That's it, John.
I think it's difficult because if we're going to have a cap, we almost need the help of the EU to run with that. So, for example, the French, they're making it pretty easy for people to come over here. So we almost need the help of those guys. On a separate matter, I actually run an international business, and the problem that we've got is a lot of these companies are quite scared about a cap because we have a massive skills shortage in the UK. And getting the people over here is what these companies need. If big companies can't attract the talent from abroad, then they'll end up leaving. And I think it's a really difficult issue because there's two sides to it.
Can I come in on that point? Because I think it's really important. When I did the shadow immigration role, I went around the country talking to communities and to businesses about immigration. And wherever I talked to businesses, I said to them, what's the thing that's going to inhibit your success over the next 3 to 5 years? And wherever I went in the country, including here, whatever the size of the business and whatever the type of the business, they all said skills. And a lot of the recruitment they were doing that has an effect on the numbers was because they couldn't get the skills here. So I started a discussion about immigration, ended with a discussion about skills. And that is a huge political failure, that we in this country have not got a programme, we haven't got a scheme, we haven't got a way of making sure that the skills we need are available in the UK. I don't want to stop companies recruiting from other countries for the skills they need, of course, but they shouldn't be required to do so because of the political failure to have a skills agenda in this country.
Right. You say in red, in the red.
I agree with Nick, it should be an honest debate, but not a scaremongering debate. It should be about, you know, none of us know what it would have carried on for years and years, what the numbers coming across would have been. So services, you know, all it is, all we're saying is just a control on who can come in and who can't. Not you can't come in, you can't come in. It's just a debate and a control, not just, you know, there's lots of scaremoney. Nick saying that, oh, people can't come in, or Alex is saying we're going to send off people. What, you know, what would you do if 300,000 come into Scotland every year, Alex? Would you still be agreed on immigration?
One of the reasons that Scotland voted so heavily from Remain is there isn't the same anxiety about immigration and people coming from other countries. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is there's not a family in the whole of Scotland who doesn't have somebody who emigrated to Australia, Canada, United States or whatever. So it's not easy to sell a message like UKIP were trying to do, that somehow these immigrants were a burden, since every family has someone who's an emigrant who's made a great success of their life elsewhere. And the second reason is equally important. We have parts of Scotland which have suffered not from immigration, but from emigration. And if you've seen depopulation and what the lack of people and the lack of services and the lack of schools and empty glens and empty villages and empty towns, if you see what that does to a community, then you'll never fear immigration again, because emigration and depopulation is much, much worse.
Why are they leaving, Alex? You're not doing a very good job.
Alex mentions Scotland, and today, of course, there was what seemed to be a rather cool discussion between Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon about this whole issue of how the Brexit negotiations are conducted. Stuart Nash, you've got a question on this. Let's just have that for a moment, shall we?
Will Brexit unite or spell the end of the Union?
Melanie Phillips, do you think Brexit is going to unite or is it going to spell the end of the Union?
I don't think it's going to spell the end of the Union, and I very much hope it won't. I think the Union is bigger than its constituent parts. The United Kingdom is stronger through having its constituent nations belonging to it.
Would it be a worry to you if it did mean the end of the UK?
Yes, it would worry me. It would worry me. On the other hand, I think that democratic self-government cannot be held hostage by the feelings of people in one part of this country. I have great respect for Scotland. I have great sympathy with the aspirations of a number of Scots for independence. But the question is whether it will lead to the break of the Union. Personally, I don't think it will, because I think that the Scots are extremely level-headed and sensible individuals, and that when they look at, as I think they already are, at the hard facts of what would happen to Scotland if it were to gain independence from Britain, in the event of Britain leaving the European Union, I think just on economic terms alone, it is to Scotland's disadvantage. They can see that the European Union is not going to be overly enthusiastic about encouraging similar secessionary movements in other parts of Europe. And so I don't actually think it's going to happen. Also, I think it's really jumping the gun. If Scotland wants independence, that's one issue. But the issue at the moment is whether or not it should be allowed to conduct a second referendum before the Brexit negotiations are concluded. And the argument, as I understand it from Nicola Sturgeon, is that it was always understood that if there was a material change in the circumstances of Scotland inside the United Kingdom, then all bets would be off and another referendum would be called. But no material change will have happened until the final deal is done. Yeah, but the Scots will have no idea what they are voting for.
The question, let's just leave aside the timing of a referendum. The question is whether the deal that's done by David Davis on behalf of the UK is one that could satisfy opinion in Scotland. Let me just hear from, I'll come to you, Alex, but let's hear from you, sir, in the middle there, yes, with glasses on. No, the guy to the right there, yeah.
I'm just worried that the Scottish referendum question has moved from being an issue about the union to being an issue of subtle political blackmail. I believe a union of 300 years.
Westminster, David Davis being blackmailed by Scotland.
Yes, it's become a news on every major UK government decision, and I think if there's a second referendum and they lose it, there will be a third one, a fourth one, as soon as there's any major decision.
Alex Salmond.
For the information of Melanie, in the SNP manifesto last year, Nicola Sturgeon, on page 23, put in the commitment that if there were a material change in circumstances, such as Scotland being taken out of the European Union against the will of the Scottish people, then the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum. Now, that was a manifesto commitment. In the last few weeks around the budget and small business, we've seen what happens to governments who try to ditch their manifesto commitment. That was in her manifesto. She was re-elected resoundingly with 47% of the vote. And the Scottish Parliament has every right to implement that manifesto.
But, Alec, I don't want to... we've heard a lot about that, but what about what David Davis is going to negotiate? Is there an outcome of those negotiations which could satisfy Scotland so that the issue of another referendum wouldn't arise?
Yes, there is. And in answer to the gentleman, before Christmas, Nicola Sturgeon put forward the position paper, Scotland's Place in Europe, where it said, look, the way to resolve these differences, and there's no real attempt being made to do it just now. I mean, you know, Ireland's in stalemate, the Welsh are alienated, Scotland's going to have another referendum, and England's still split 50-50. I mean, this unifying the country isn't going very well. But Nicola Sturgeon put forward the view that the way to do it was for the UK to stay within the single marketplace, to leave the European Union, but to stay within the single marketplace. And if that weren't possible, then for Northern Ireland, or Scotland in particular, in our document, for Scotland to have a special deal within the single marketplace, even if the UK were to leave it. Now, that was the position paper, so many other things as well, like protecting the right of European citizens in Scotland and workers' rights in Scotland, a really important issue in this debate. But that was the position paper.
All right,
well, the government's had it for more than 3 months. Nicola Sturgeon hasn't even had an answer. She wasn't even consulted about the Article 50 letter. The meetings of the Joint Ministerial Committee that weren't to take place didn't take place. The Welsh delegation described them as being conducted like a parish council. So the attitude towards not just Scotland but the other devolved administration has been contemptuous from the Westminster government.
All right, well, let's leave it there for the moment, Alex.
She has every right to go to the Scottish Parliament and implement the mandate.
David Davis, what do you say to this? That there have been no serious negotiations, though we all know they were promised at the beginning.
Well, there were,
and can you deliver a deal that would satisfy Scottish opinion?
There have been 2 meetings of so-called Joint Ministerial Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, more than there have been in most years in the last decade. There have been 4 Joint Ministerial Committees on this subject alone, attended by the Scottish Government, gentleman who I saw today, attended by the Welsh Government and by the Northern Irish Executive whilst it
And what note do you take of what you're told by them?
And, oh, quite a lot. I mean, take for example, take that, that paper, the white paper which was discussed and debated at the Joint Ministerial Committee. Some aspects of it, protection of employee rights, absolutely taken on board and made a major part of our policy.
What about being in the single market? What about Scotland being in the single market, which is a crucial one?
The single market issue. Now, what's the single market membership about? It's about maintaining jobs, it's about maintaining access to the single market, being able to sell products and services into the single market. What are we trying to get? A comprehensive free trade arrangement which does just that, which allows us to sell into the single market. So the distinction becomes one of, well, how do you do it? And the Scottish proposal is that they now, alone, should be a member of the single market whilst the rest of the United Kingdom is not. That means they've got to sign up to free movement of people. So you can have free movement of people to Edinburgh, but not to London. They've got to sign up to the European Court of Human Rights, they've got to sign up to all of the elements. In other words, they want to break the country in 2. What a surprise. What a surprise.
OK, you say in the front. Yep. You. Hold on now. Yes.
Hi. Can I just take a deep breath and acknowledge something? In a general election or a by-election, people, by and large, I think, go by party lines. They may be swayed by arguments of the time, but they go with the party they would usually vote for. In the referendum, it was completely different. Whole families voted different ways, communities. I know from reading Craig Oliver's excellent book that there were many, many surprises on both sides all the way throughout. Coming here tonight, watching Question Time in the audience for the first time, watch it at home, it's very, very hard for people to really decide what the truth is because arguments seem to be made still on party lines by people sat up there. I think it's very, very hard for people sat at home to really decide and understand what's going on here. Like for the referendum, there was Project Fair, there were the Nigel Farage posters. People heard the arguments made, but it's still very, very hard because everyone seems to have a diametrically opposed opinion, and that's all well and good when there's an election, but the decision's already been made, and we're all sat at home thinking that we're pretty much powerless, and we don't really have, I personally don't have a great deal of faith in the people in power to exercise a decision when you can't even agree on what's going to happen and the decision's already out of our hands. It's up to you.
Keir Starmer.
I'm very grateful for you making that point because we were split down the middle. It was a narrow decision, 52-48, almost halfway down the country. Now, obviously, I campaigned passionately to stay in the EU, but I did it on the basis that the outcome would be binding, and that's why I and the Labour Party have accepted the result. But what we now need to do it's harder than it seems, is to go forward in a way that unifies the country and actually works both for those that voted to leave and for those that voted to remain. And I think one of the concerns about the government's approach is that those that voted to remain feel that they've been written out of their own future. And we have to have an agreement that actually works for both sides, as it were, of our country. And we have to stop talking in this way that perpetuates the division. And that's why I've set out today 6 tests which are based on the idea that if we can't be members of the EU, because that was the referendum question, how can we be close partners with our EU countries and colleagues and have something that works for future generations, because we are talking about generational change here. So that's why it's so important to build the consensus. And I think David and the government set out months ago saying they're going to try and build a consensus across the nations and regions. I'm afraid they failed to do that. And today is further evidence of that, and they need to work harder. I think the Prime Minister's taken quite an isolationist approach and not wanted to be open with accountability and scrutiny. We wanted to have Parliament more involved, and at every twist and turn, the Prime Minister said no.
All right,
actually, a collegiate approach is better.
We'll talk about that in a moment. Just hear from 1 or 2 more people about the point. You up there, yes.
The SNP seems to be pushing the Scottish referendum as if access to the single market for them is a foregone conclusion. You have no idea what's going to happen if you did leave the UK. You have no idea what access to Europe you're going to get. So I feel like it's just a foolish stunt at bringing a Scottish referendum earlier, when originally it was only going to be if we couldn't get access to the single market. So it does appear like you're moving the goalposts and you're aiming towards a referendum regardless of the circumstances.
You better have... Not everyone on the panel has spoken to this yet, but since it's directed at you, Alex, perhaps you just quickly answer that.
In 18 months to 2 years' time, we'll know what the shape of the Brexit deal is. And the House of Commons and every other parliament across the European Union is going to be given a choice, take it or leave it. And it's not a real choice, incidentally, because leave it, as we've already discussed, the single market is going to be a really bad choice. So why shouldn't the people of Scotland have the same ability to choose between the Brexit deal of David Davis or independence in Europe? Now, by that time, the proposition that will go forward to the Scottish people will involve continuous membership of the single market, because the choice is not now, the choice is 18 months' time. Now, one last thing. The Prime Minister, when she came to Scotland, the week after she was elected, she said and gave a commitment that she would not sign Article 50 until there was an agreed UK position backed by Scotland. These were her words. There has been no such agreement, but she's intent on going ahead on Wednesday and invoking Article 50. It's a clear breach of faith and breach of her word, and Nicola Sturgeon is quite entitled to go to the Scottish Parliament and ask for support.
Nick Clegg, do you agree with that? A breach of faith? Yes. But before you do, just answer, if you can, that point, if you can take the two. His point that there's been a breach of faith with Scotland. Do you agree with that?
I feel plague on both houses. I don't think Scottish
Really?
nationalism... No, I don't think Scottish nationalism is an answer to
plague on the whole UK?
No. No. We're now squeezed, I think, in the United Kingdom, for those of us who are not Scottish nationalists or members of the Conservative Party or UKIP, between a sort of resurgent English nationalism in the Conservative Party and UKIP in Westminster and a resurgent Scottish nationalism north of the border. I don't think nationalism is a sensible solution to the world's modern problems, whether it's north or south of the border. And I just think it's been very unhelpful that the SNP have jumped opportunistically to trigger another referendum on independence, as it was, by the way, totally predictable that by pursuing this self-harming hard Brexit and yanking us out of the single market, yanking us out of the customs union, choices which we didn't need to make as a country, and by the way, choices that David Davis, before he went into government, used to argue against.
Yes.
By doing that, of course you provoke tensions within our own family of nations. But can I just very quickly, to the gentleman earlier who said it's so difficult for the public to kind of work out what happens next, those who I feel most kind of, my heart goes out most to, is the youngsters who voted in very large numbers. 18 to 24-year-olds voted in very large numbers. Over 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted on the 23rd of June last year, and 70% of them said they don't want this future. So we have taken, as a country, for better or for worse, I think for worse, a huge decision about our future against the explicit stated wishes of those who have to inhabit that future. In other words, the young. They have to live with the consequences of this decision. And that's what I think, when we finally know what the deal is, of course it's right that that decision about whether we adopt that deal should not be left to David Davis or Theresa May or to the politicians. It should be given back to the people.
Suzanne Evans, we will come to that. we will come to that. But Suzanne Evans, on this point about the Union.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, Alec, you talk about Scotland and you talk about the people of Scotland, but what you mean is actually you talk about the SNP. And the SNP does not represent the whole. And just a couple of points. A third of SNP voters voted for Brexit. So, and also, you know, I think what Melanie said right at the beginning of this discussion is absolutely spot on. The Scottish people are very sensible. They know that Scotland economically is 4 times as reliant on the United Kingdom as it is on the European Union.
Okay.
And it is absolutely not just, for emotional reasons, just because of our country and the future of our country as a united country. And I very much hope Scotland will stay part of the United Kingdom. But, you know, it's a good thing for Scotland to stay in because it's in Scotland's best interest. And at the end of the day, after Brexit, at least, Alex, I know what currency I'm going to have in my pocket. The SNP, if you leave the European UK, you won't have a clue what currency.
All right, now wait a minute. We'll have a lot more on Scotland. You've had a long answer. Alex, if you could bring yourself to be very brief.
Right, very briefly. Nicola Sturgeon can't get an SNP majority for the referendum in the Scottish Parliament. She has to get a majority across the Parliament. She needs the support for another political party, the Greens, to get that majority. And she's not speaking just for the SNP, she's trying to articulate the view of the nation. And whatever the votes for the SNP, which incidentally are 20 times the votes for UKIP, whatever the votes for the SNP, whatever the votes for the SNP, the vast, overwhelming majority of people in Scotland want to stay within the single marketplace. And they certainly want to treat other Europeans as citizens.
All right, I want David Davis just to answer the point you made earlier, that Scotland had been betrayed in these discussions already by the Prime Minister promising she'd do one thing and then not. And then I want to go on to the question that you raised about what happens now, because that's I think probably the last area we go into is how this proceeds and what control the British public as a whole has over it. But David, do you want to answer that point?
I mean, when Alec actually said this in the House of Commons, he was careful to cite it as a quotation from a newspaper rather than the original fact. And he's answered himself. And the simple truth is that what the Prime Minister said is she would seek consensus. She can't demand consensus, and frankly, the Scottish National Party doesn't want to have consensus. It wants to have its own so-called compromise solution, which is single market membership for itself. Now, I want to just answer Nick, because Nick lectured us all on honesty earlier. He started off by saying he started off by saying that I had made this argument before, untrue. The argument he was now making, and he said we want to have membership of the single market, and he's ignoring something really rather important. To have membership of the single market, you've got to allow free movement. You've got to accept free movement. You've got to accept the rule of the European Court of Justice, not human rights, I said earlier. European Court of Justice.
Hang on, the 6th of April 2014, you wrote, first we should retain access to the EU single market.
Access. Is it the membership and access are different things, Nick. That's the point. If the Liberal Party can't realise that, that's right. Retain access.
But it's a meaningless thing to say. Everybody has access.
You were the one who were lecturing on honesty. I'm afraid you've got to be honest about the facts you're talking to now. And the last point about it is, of course, that being in a single market, you know, it's virtually impossible to be outside the European Union and be in the single market unless you're going to behave like EFTA and accept all the rules handed down from somebody else. So I'm afraid this simply does not stand up. The British people voted to leave the European Union, not stay half in, half out.
But just to be clear, but access to the single market and paying for access to the single market is something you will go along with.
No, and I didn't say that. Access to the single market is...
Any contribution for access to the single market, of course we'd consider it.
Consider, yeah.
Yeah, consider. Come on. If you consider it, you're not ruling it out.
As the Prime Minister corrected me later that day, she said, yes, he'd consider it. Didn't mean we'd do it.
But David,
well, I don't know what kind of considering that is. I don't think he'd be at all pleased or convinced by that kind of considering.
I mean, you don't understand it. It just doesn't make sense.
I'm not the Prime Minister, luckily. Right, I'm going to take a question from Zubair Khan, please. Zubair Khan.
Should the British people have a vote on the final Brexit deal agreed?
All right, let's take this now. Should the British people have a vote on the final Brexit deal agreed? In other words, what happens, David Davis, when you come back with your deal? It's said it's going to be put to Parliament. as a yes or no vote. That's where it stands at the moment.
That's
Is that it?
That's exactly right.
Is that that's the end of it?
Because the decision taken by the British people was taken on June 23rd, and that was the point of no return. We voted by a massive majority in the House of Commons to give them the referendum, to give the British people a referendum on this subject, and it was said at the dispatch box by the Minister presenting the bill, presenting the Act of Parliament, that this will be a decision for the British people, not advice, decision for the British people. So yes, that's the stance. Now, you ask about a referendum. This is the Liberal Party policy, a second referendum. If you want to encourage the European negotiators in this to give us the worst possible deal, that's the way to do it.
Why so?
Yeah, that's the way. Because,
just explain it.
Yeah, I will. Because if you, what they want is to keep us in. What they want to keep us in. And if you had another referendum, another run at the referendum, they would give us the worst deal, so in the hope that we would vote to stay in. For our money, for our involvement, for the contribution we make to the European Union, in all sorts of ways, that's what they would do. Come on.
All right.
I think it's really important that Parliament has a say in this, and that's why we've been arguing for what I termed a meaningful vote in Parliament, which is the ability of MPs to vote on the deal that comes back in 2 years' time.
You've been offered that?
And absolutely, and we intend, and that's why I set out test today, we intend to use that because if the Prime Minister comes back with a deal which doesn't have the confidence of Parliament, then that is not a good deal for our country. So that's a really important vote in Parliament. Now, that hopefully will be in the autumn of 2018. And if it's not good enough, the instruction will be to the Prime Minister to go and negotiate some more. And this idea that it's a take-it-or-leave-it vote is a political choice on the part of the Prime Minister. So that's a very, very important point of grip. As for a second referendum, I'm afraid that lots of people making the argument for a second referendum are not being honest about whether it's achievable, because all that will happen in 2 years' time, if this goes in the direction I hope it'll go in, is that we'll have a transitional arrangement in March 2019. You can't have a referendum on a transitional arrangement. The final deal is likely to be after a transitional period, perhaps 2 or 3 years after a transitional period, by which time we will have formally left the EU. So, in other words, what's being put forward is the false promise, if you like, of a referendum that isn't going to happen. And politically, this is important because either we stand up and face... I didn't want to leave the EU. I passionately campaigned to stay in. But now the decision is made, we either stand up and confront the challenges in front of us, or we spend the whole time looking behind us trying to rub out the decision that was made.
But what happens
and I don't
if
think we're going to succeed if we do the same.
But what happens if you have this vote and you get David Davis comes back and the government presents it, and there is, perhaps unlikely, but in view of the numbers in the House of Commons, but there is a vote against it? What happens then?
Well,
you send him back again, have another go? That's like the referendum. If they think that's going to happen, they'll be taking his referendum argument and not bothering. Alice, what do you think?
This is why,
do you think there's any chance of it happening, first of all?
This vote in the House of Commons is totally artificial, because it'll come either 18 months' time or 2 years' time.
October
it'll be October 2018. Let's say it's October 2018, and then it'll be accept it or reject it.
Why?
And because there's
the Prime Minister says so.
Because there's a 2-year time limit on these negotiations. No, and I had put an amendment to make sure if it was rejected, we'd stay in. But I can't remember if the Labour Party decided to support that amendment here. In fact, I think it was before you were focused on these things and didn't. It's an artificial choice. Take it or leave it. It's going to be bounced.
On
the question of referendum, you would have to have a general election in which people argued in a general election to hold another referendum and got a mandate for doing it. Unfortunately, the past was sold in the referendum, where the majority of people, including the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, voted for this referendum 2 years ago in the House of Commons. I think they were wrong to do so, but the past was sold in that, and the only way you can get another referendum is if a general election gives a party a mandate to reconsider the whole position.
The one here in the front, in the second row.
Well, personally, I'm not sure whether another referendum is the right way to go, but quite frankly, there are a lot of people in this country who think, how the hell can we trust a government to have our best interests at heart and get the best deal for us when they haven't had our best interests before? You know, they say, oh, you know, Theresa May comes out and says we need more funding for mental health. A week later, what's being cut? Mental health, right? How can we trust someone who
But there was a referendum.
How can we how can we trust someone who
But there was a
wrongfully deported
referendum.
50,000 students, right? No, there's been a referendum. We leave, right? We've got that. But how can we trust them to get the best deal for us when they haven't done it beforehand?
Ah, I see. Melanie Phillips.
Well, I have great sympathy with that, and I think
We have to be quick now because we're coming towards the end of the programme.
It's a widespread problem, this lack of trust in government. The fact is, we are in a parliamentary democracy. That is our system. We had a referendum on the constitutional issue of whether or not Britain should leave the EU. We voted out. Our system means we entrust the government to negotiate, and Parliament rightly will have a say on the final negotiation. So much of this argument is, I think, a covert way of Remainers trying to overturn the will of the British people. This is... It sounds very seductive. Let's kind of bridge the gap between Remainers and Brexiteers. If I hear these terms, hard Brexit and soft Brexit, I shall throw up. There is no hard Brexit and soft Brexit. There is simply Brexit. And what is being said...
Keir Starmer's saying this is absolute rubbish.
What is meant by soft Brexit is keeping us within the EU rules, which means effectively half in, half out. It is an attempt by Remainers to pretend to be obeying the will of the British people, while in the detail trying to overturn...
All right, you've made the point. Nick Clegg, I'll come back to you. Nick Clegg. And we only have a couple of minutes left, so be brief if you
Very
would.
quickly, I mean, Davis, this is beneath you. We've known each other for many years. You cannot claim that it would somehow be impossible for a democracy to be able to negotiate successfully an international agreement. By your logic, when David Davis said that having another referendum on the final deal, it would be an incentive to give the United Kingdom a bad deal, by that reckoning, the only governments that could successfully negotiate good international agreements with each other are dictatorships, where you never allow the people to have another say again. It's a ludicrous argument. Secondly, you used to make this argument. I've got the quote here. You used to advocate a double referendum strategy, and I quote now, you didn't like the last time I quoted you, we also commit the country to a decision referendum to be held when the EU negotiation is concluded. And then you said something rather wise. You said, if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy. And the question is, as ever, who decides? Let's say we have a deal. Who decides? Is it Theresa May on her own in number 10? Is it a bunch of politicians in Westminster? Or is it you? And I believe it should be you.
Suzanne Evans. And you have to be very brief, I'm afraid, Suzanne, because we only have a minute or so left.
We had a referendum back in 1975. We've changed our mind. We've had another one. We're leaving. UKIP's very much in favour of referendums. But we can't carry on having referendums on referendums on referendums. The Vote Leave campaign made it very clear what we want from Brexit. And, David, the country's looking to you to deliver it.
OK. All right. Keir Starmer, a last brief word, please.
I just want to squelch this idea that there's only one form of Brexit. I accept the result. I think I now, and many other people, should have a role in shaping the future. There is a world of difference between crashing out without a deal, severing our ties with Europe, and on the other hand, having a partnership, a collaborative, cooperative future with Europe. And I've got children, and the next generation require us and want us to shape the future for them. And simply saying there's no choice, they are very different futures, and we've got to fight for the future that we want for the next generation.
Well, now, look, I've got to stop because we have to make way for today's news and all the rest of it, but I want to just say to all of you here who had your hands up and didn't get a chance, I'm sorry. I don't apologise to any of the panel because they've all had a good shout. We've got the Article 50 on Wednesday and the letter from the Prime Minister to Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, from Theresa May, and a response apparently in 48 hours. There'll be plenty more to talk about. Thursday, the so-called Great Repeal Bill. We'll get the details of that, of all the legislation moving here. So my thanks to our panel, to all of you who came here to Birmingham to take part.